But now that she was dead, I was forced to face the clutter and jumble of old clothes and broken delf. I put the palm of my hand on the old storage heater in the hallway and checked that it was cold. In the drawing room, I checked another heater. The room was stuffy. The windows had not been opened for a long time, and the sun had blazed into the room through June and July. But the radiators were off, so that was fine. Then I went upstairs. A solid carpeted stairway, though it creaked in the same places as it had done years before when I was coming home from carnivals as a teenager in the middle of the night and would want to reach my bed without waking either of my parents. There was a musty smell on the landing and in the corridor. I tried to open the bathroom window, but it almost fell apart, so I left it as it was. It was my first time in the house since she had died 2 days earlier, and I didn't want to hang around too long. But I was drawn to a chair. It was in the front room, a chair that I had bought for her 5 years earlier in McIntyre's Furniture World. At the time, she could not manage to get up out of the low, soft armchairs, and this one had a high seat and a straight back. In all other respects it was fine, soft, upholstered throne, but she always looked rigid in it, and just before she went into the nursing home, she was beginning to have difficulty getting out of it as well. I remember being terrified each week when I was saying goodbye, in case she fell. She'd stand up, escort me to the hall and close the door behind me. Then she'd walk back to the front room and throw herself in the general direction of the chair. I'd be outside the window looking in. She'd aim her body, and all I could do was stand there gawking and hope she wouldn't miss. If she missed the chair and fell, she'd break her hip with me looking in through the window. But now I was looking at the chair. I could almost see her sitting there and hear her speak, as she once spoke to me many years ago when I was in the pit of depression and had come to her for comfort. "If you want to cry, go upstairs." That's what she said coldly, when tears threatened my face in the same room in 1979. I was 26, a grown adult, and yet I craved for her to hold me. And for a moment our eyes met, and I saw in her a naked terror, and I felt her helplessness. It was like a sound coming from a closed room where she had lived alone and untouched for too long. She could never have held me then. I could see that. She could never hold anyone again. Yes, she could still be held by other people, though who came to her door sustained her. Those who met her in the supermarket and in the street, and the nurses, the doctor, the home help, and all her friends. They all held her, and the world held her, and the routines of her life held her, like going to 10 a.m. Mass every morning for years, or making her porridge in the microwave before going to bed, so that all she had to do in the morning was press the button and reheat it. All those routines held her. It wasn't her fault that she could not hold me. She just wasn't able to do it. And realizing that felt like some kind of intimacy. Of course, they say that men ought not to cry openly, but to me it has always seemed natural. I know men cry in public with a kind of bravado or performance skill at football matches and whenever they're watching rugby in a pub, but there is a reluctance to share tears in any intimate situation. They go out to the street and cry. They leave the room. They apologize. Even I prefer to cry alone. It's not something I like to do with someone staring me in the face, apart from my therapist. But over the years, I have certainly cried a lot, whether because of mental anguish, fear of the future, or just as a result of something trivial on the television, like the sight of women in period costumes on BBC as they rise up in rebellion against Mr. Darcy or other such patriarchs, with the surprise of larks. I often wonder what women would think of me if they knew that. And I remember one occasion when I caught my old friend, the General, in tears, and I had to look away. I was getting water from the tap in his yard one afternoon just before New Year, during a cold spell. I'd noticed that the snow all about me was stained with blood, where they had shot a horse on Christmas Day. She slipped on the ice, the General had said, and we could do nothing for her. His eyes had watered, and he'd looked at the empty snow with such confusion that no one could doubt but that he had loved his mare. And I remember the time foot and mouth swept the country, and big farmers from Monaghan, Tyrone and the Cooley Peninsula had wept every evening on the television news like little boys. The camera would catch them standing in a gateway with a stick in hand, and the field behind them full of beautiful beasts, black and white dairy cows, the descendants of cattle that had grazed the same fields decades earlier. "Me father had this herd and his father before him," the farmer would be saying, and then he would turn to take a glance at the field, and he was broken. "They'll all have to go," he'd say, the words whispered, and the tears welling and overflowing in his eyes. And their crying often made me cry. I spent years wrapped in sorrowful lament, posing as a melancholic poet in my college days, affecting the airs of a devout saint in various churches in later years, and when alone I released myself with tears that would fill a lake. But as I gazed at my own mother's chair, I felt like I had a stone in my chest, and no matter what I touched, I couldn't cry. For the first month after my mother died, in July of 2012, I walked about the world with a new lightness. It's not something I admitted to anyone, but I felt a sense of exhilaration to be above ground when someone so solid and enduring as mother was no more. Then, after a certain time, issues began to arise. Letters started coming in the door. There were all sorts of institutions that needed forms to be filled in and evidence submitted to establish that this person was now legally dead. Most importantly, her death certificate needed to be completed. And then I needed to fill in forms in order to close her bank account and to close down her social welfare file and to repay the 2 weeks' pension that had inadvertently gone into her account on the day of her death, and to close the account with the nursing home. The solicitor phoned and asked if I could deliver the death certificate as soon as possible so that they could sort out probate on her estate. I should pick it up at the registrar office, he said, which was in a small building at the gates of Cavan General Hospital and happened to be just across the road from Glenismole, which is the house, or the name of the house, where I had grown up. So a week after the funeral, I returned to Cavan and drove past the wrought iron front gate, rusting at the sides and at all the joints, and I saw the name plate on which Glenismole was hardly visible because of the moss and the green slime. In the register office, I spoke to a woman behind the counter and filled in the forms and got the certificate. Then I brought it to the solicitor's office, and that was the end of it. But on the way home, driving past the house again and seeing its closed gate and vacant upstairs windows, I decided to go inside for no particular reason. It was my first visit since the day of the funeral, and this time I decided to examine things in more detail. From the sunroom at the back of the house, I passed through the kitchen, a room she had insisted on carpeting about 10 years before she died, because her feet got cold on the bare tiles. The Sacred Heart picture on the wall was faded, and the ink scrawl that marked her husband's, her own and her children's names had been erased by time. A round tin of Rose's chocolates sat on the table, but none of those things disturbed me. In the drawing room, Pope Benedict stared at me from a postcard on the mantelpiece. The German theologian leered out from the frame with eyes that my daughter had once observed were very creepy. But that didn't disturb me either. His photograph was flanked by long-legged African birds, like herons, carved in black ebony. They had been brought from Nigeria in 1966 by Father Pat, a distant cousin. There were pictures of the two boys, as she called me and my brother, in First Communion suits beside the birds. A bland landscape painting of an English meadow hung over the mantelpiece. An electric heater with fake flames behind a dark glass was tucked into the fire grate. A small television sat on the coffee table in the opposite corner. A cream nightdress hung across the back of the high armchair. A bundle of Sunday newspapers lay on the floor, yellowed by 2 years of sunlight. The standard lamp, under which my father had once read his books, was still plugged in, and a bookcase in which he had locked away his precious books stood in the corner. I peered through the glass and wondered where the key might be. Not that there was much of interest in there, apart from old Catholic apologists from the 1930s and a few accountancy volumes that he had read for his examinations many years earlier, and a long brown envelope containing his will. The sofa that no one had sat on for years was piled high with pillows, bed linen, and nightdresses. The card table was dusty. It had come originally from my grandmother's house, a dull, broken antique that spent some years in a shed. Mother had had it restored by the Robinson brothers in Killishandra, and when she brought it home, she glowed with happiness to have such a memento of her own mother. It was made of polished mahogany, a central stem branching into 4 delicate legs. The table itself was square, but could be folded to half its size, with drawers underneath for the cards. The drawers had eventually filled up with bottles of cough mixture, tablets, tubes of ointment for her legs, a white raincoat, a pack of cards, and some rosary beads. And the table too had gathered dust for 2 years. The cream wallpaper was falling off the walls behind a drinks cabinet in the opposite corner, which she had taken from her brother Oliver's house when he died, though Oliver never drank in his entire life, and I always thought it was an unusual memento by which to remember him. But he was an enormous figure in my mother's little world, and he had achieved great success as a civil servant, eventually becoming the secretary to 3 presidents. When I was a child, he was the benchmark of dignity, success, and ethical standards in our family. He had lived alone in a semi-detached house on Crowpatrick Road in Dublin, and I had marvelled at the timer on his cooker, which could trigger the hot plates at the stroke of noon to heat potatoes, and have them ready for his lunch when he walked in the door to the red formica table in his little kitchen, a stone's throw from the president's residence, Orison-Uachtaráin. Every summer he had holidayed on the Aran Islands, speaking Irish and reading books. His feet had spread in his sandals, and he found it difficult to get them back into the stiff shoe leather when his holiday was over and his presence was once again required on the lush carpets of Orison-Uachtaráin. Now he sleeps enfolded in the arms of his own mother and beside his father on a slope in Cully's graveyard, side by side with girls who died in the Poor Clare orphanage fire, and all the other unremembered and remembered heroes of Cavan Town. I often drove mother out to put flowers on his grave, close to where a new road has been cut through the drumlins and which shortens the journey to Enniskillen, and on which the traffic flows day and night. The trucks honk their horns, and the noise is carried in the wind into the graveyard and across the tombstones of the resting dead. In the hallway of mother's house, the wallpaper was also in tatters from the dampness that had inched up behind it from year to year, and the floor, where I remember red and cream tiles in my childhood, had been carpeted with a dizzy paisley design on a cream background. A yellow 2-bar electric heater sat idle at the first step of the stairs, sitting there since a care worker had noticed that the flex was frayed and had insisted on taking it away so that it wouldn't cause a fire. Mother had thought she was robbing it, so the care worker had left it alone, where it remained for years. But none of that upset me. I was uneasy about opening the dining room door because for 2 years mother had slept in there when she could no longer negotiate the stairs, before finally surrendering to the prospect of ending her days in a nursing home. The sideboard on the left was cluttered with wedding gifts from that sunny day in late August 1950, although nothing had been polished for years, and a film of dust clung to the little spouts and delicate handles of the teapot and the gravy boat, the salt and pepper canisters, the sugar bowls and little trays for fish knives. On the mantelpiece there were more photos of her sons and 2 vases with plastic snowdrops and a machine for making espresso coffee, which she got from someone in Saudi Arabia, but which she had remained convinced was no more than an ornament. An enormous mound of old clothes was piled in the far corner. It was like a refuse heap in a charity shop, and it was impossible to get into that part of the room. Behind all the rags was a hi-fi black box record player, which had been my father's pride and joy when he was in the Gramophone Society in the 1950s. The members would meet in the Farnham Arms Hotel every fortnight, and at each meeting a different member would play a selection of their favourite records while the others listened. I heard my father once say that he particularly enjoyed the evenings when the local doctor was in charge because he loved opera and brought recordings of many famous arias, and he could bring La Traviata or La Bohème to life. The librarian was fond of music too, and she would often tell me how wonderful the previous night's recital had been, describing the music in detail while she stamped my copy of Treasure Island or kidnapped when I went in for a new book after school. How anyone could describe a movement of classical music in terms of mountains, valleys, and soft breezes astonished me, and her enthusiasm and her descriptions inspired me to take out my father's records sometimes from the shelves beneath the black box and listen to Gilbert and Sullivan or the piano music of Chopin. On the top of the black box there was a photo of Uncle Oliver in a tuxedo, a black overcoat and a white scarf. It would have infuriated my father if he had seen Oliver smiling on top of his precious black box. But father was long dead when the photo was put there, and by then mother had forgotten what the black box was for. Oliver is beaming with joy in the photograph as he holds his arm around a young woman in an evening gown. He looks surprised and pleased at the camera, though he never married or spoke of any woman in romantic terms, which made it another strange memento by which to remember him. Another television set had been placed in the corner of this room on a rickety wicker stool, so mother could view it from the bed. Not that she needed high definition at that stage. She had lost interest in the material world, but I think she still needed images out there in the room to distract her from the things in her own mind. 2 rolls of toilet paper and a bottle of air freshener sat on top of the television, within reach if she was sitting on the commode next to it. Saint Bernadette viewed all this from a picture above the commode. It was a framed picture I had owned when I was a priest in Fermanagh, given to me by a woman who had been in Lourdes, hoping to find relief from cancer, or at least serenity on her deathbed. In the centre of the room was a single bed with a mattress which I had bought the same day as I bought the chair. The electric blanket was off, but still plugged in. The sheets were crumpled, and the duvet was half rolled down. I pressed my hand into the pillow, making a dent, and then I could really imagine she had just moved the duvet away and got out of bed a few moments earlier. I suppose I should have sorted all this out when she first went into the nursing home, but I didn't. On top of the little locker beside the bed there were various bottles and tablets, and empty Maalox bottles, and an unopened naggin of brandy, and more handbags, and a rosary of gaudy purple beads, and a glass beaker that had once held mother's teeth while she slept. There were prayer leaflets honouring saints, and memorial cards for various relations and friends, and 3 pictures of Padre Pio praying with his wounded hands joined before his face. Inside the locker, at the very back, behind more bed linen, my fingers found another rosary. Old black beads with a gigantic crucifix, which had been woven around my grandmother's fingers as she lay dying in a house on Bridge Street in 1963, and which my mother had cherished after that funeral. I took the beads with me as I returned to the kitchen and placed them on the table beside the tin of chocolates. When I opened the round glass door of the washing machine, more night dresses fell out on the floor, and I could see other small things inside which terrified me, so I pushed them all back and closed the door again. Saucepans, pots, and 2 frying pans sat on the small cooker and on the chair beneath the window. I noticed a red plastic basin with a face towel draped on the side. There was a toothbrush, a tube of paste, a bar of soap sitting on a plastic dish in the basin. The Rayburn had once been fuelled by coal and rarely went out, and it was there that she used to cook chicken soup when I was a child. But in her late 70s she had no one to cook for any more, and the coal buckets were heavy, and what she ate herself could be heated in a microwave or boiled in a small electric cooker in the back kitchen. But no smoke had risen in the Rayburn chimney for 30 years to disturb the crows that nested. On top of the Rayburn there was only a black kettle from my grandmother's world, a large packet of toilet rolls, and a half-dozen plastic bags with Dunn's Stores printed on them. She saved bags each week when we went shopping, because she hated paying the extra 22 cents for a new one. But we always forgot to bring a bag, and were obliged to buy one more each week. So the bags piled high on the Rayburn beside a blue plastic folder that contained the care worker's notes and logbook. Every item, every event that had happened in the house was written in there. What work had been done, what conversations or arguments had taken place, and what physical or emotional condition my mother had been in. It was a backup to contradict any false accusations that mother might make about having been mistreated, robbed or neglected by the care worker. I sat down on a hard chair at the table and took the black rosary beads in my hand and pressed them to my lips with a reverence that was more nostalgic than true. Like many other people in Ireland, I had outgrown the devotions of my childhood, the fervour that gathered in the shelter of the church. I suppose if I could have cried, even then, it might have helped. I suppose, I'm taking a break from it for a moment, but God, as I read back on it, my mother comes back into my presence, and I'm really glad of that, because it's a funny thing. The 2nd of July is Sunday, and the 2nd of July in Cavan is Grave Sunday. And so I'll be going to visit the grave on Saturday, hopefully take away any old weeds or grass that's growing on it. And then I'll hopefully be there maybe on Sunday morning for what's called the blessing of the graves. And there's a way that I think, when I read back on that, I realise if I was teaching a class now of creative writing or how to write memoir, I would say as much detail as you can sometimes is able to give a really good picture of somebody instead of just giving your opinion what they were like. So in that piece that I've been reading, I haven't given any opinion about what I think my mother was like or how I felt about her or what our relationship was. But I think that just by describing, the rooms in the house and the bed and the duvet and the pillow and all her tablets and just all those details and the images of people she loved and how she cherished them and how each thing in the room, like the black box, the gramophone player, it brings me back other memories of my father or of Uncle Oliver. And so her world comes together through those little details. I think that's the way it is when somebody passes away. There's an unbearable pain and poignancy about the things that are left behind. Because once somebody is alive and they're using something, might be the little, glass for her false teeth at night, but once the person is alive, these things function. They're alive themselves in the world. And then once the person has passed away and they're taken away and buried, all that stuff that created a fabric of narrative around the person suddenly is meaningless and suddenly is tinged with this terrible sadness, that these things are of no use now, and that photographs are almost like they can't be admired in the same way. They were her photographs. They were her prayers, her little holy pictures. Things that functioned for her, were alive for her. And yet the moment she is gone, they tell her story. And if you're a writer, then that's a really good way to write, because if you record all the detail of something, it's a powerful way to present the person, the character. But they tell her story, and yet the poignancy is in the fact that they're no longer relevant because her story is over. They're like useless props that were used in a stage play when the theatre is empty and everybody's gone home and the actors have all moved on and the props are just lying there in the corner. That's what they are, they're props. And it does two things for me. It brings me close to my mother. It brings my mother close to me. In the remembrance of her, I feel she's close. And the other thing it does is, because I'm now 70 years of age, it's 20 years later. It's 12 years since she passed away, but it's 20 years since the house was, in a certain way alive with my mother in it. I was 50, now I'm 70. And that's like in the turning of in a breath of wind, your life is gone. And then I look at all the props I have in my life, all the little things I have in my room. Computer and wires and glasses and a glass case and just little things. My medicines. And it's very sobering, but it's very, very fruitful to remember and to reflect on mortality. For me to think that, were I to pass away suddenly, like today, imagine, that all these things would then be just the same, just useless props, no longer relevant in somebody else's life. And so there's two things happening there. One is I'm remembering my mother, and that matters to me. And the other is it helps me remember the shortness of life. Now, the shortness of life, I have to say, I think that one of the most important ways I found to counteract depression has been to go into it. In other words, sometimes a hidden anxiety about the shortness of life and how life is passing or how you're getting old, that can depress you until you look into it, until you stare it in the face. If you think about death as a character who's lurking outside your house, waiting to knock on your door to come for you, then it can leave you with a terrible sense of anxiety. But if you think about death as somebody who's out there, and you go to the door and open the door and you say, come in, death, and sit down and wait a while. I'll go with you later, but I'm not ignoring you. When you face up to the shortness of life, in some, and I have to say this is just personal, but it liberates me. It frees me from feeling sad about it. So the remembrance of the people we love can be a help because it brings them close to us. And then it helps us remember our own shortness in life. It remembers how swift this thing called life passes. And if you look at that, it actually liberates you from anxiety about it, and it allows you to say, well, it's because this life is so short, because it's so swift, that's why it's so beautiful. That's why living in the present moment is so beautiful. I'm sitting here now. It's been a cloudy day so far here in Donegal. There's nobody in the house. I've been alone here since yesterday and will be until tomorrow as I do these podcasts. And in this moment I feel this sense of joy. I feel a sense of joy just being alive in this moment. And everything I'm saying to you about how I think and reflect on the dead, it helps me towards this sense of amazement and wonder that we are alive in this moment. This life is so precious. It is sacred. This life is eternal life. There's no waiting for eternal life. It's here, it's now. It's in the moment that I'm sharing with you and you're sharing with me. This is eternity. This is heaven. And if we hold on to this moment, our belief, which is contradictory to everything scientific or rational or provable, our belief is that in this present moment of joy, we will overcome death. There's something deeper than linear time. And we're not locked into linear time when we think of the divine presence. And we get to think of the divine presence sometimes by reflecting on those we love and remembering them. Remembering all the detail of their life. And in some way they come to life again with us in memory. And there's some way that when you are remembering somebody like that, you seem to be touching a moment of eternity. And that's the moment when I talk about, when I say, like, I feel my mother is just beyond my fingertips. The remembrance, the calling to mind of people that we loved, it touches some dynamic in the heart that allows us to feel them as being present. And it also helps us to think about our own death as inevitable and our own life as just a breath, just a short moment. And when you wrap all that up, for some reason it gives you joy. And I meet people all the time now who don't have joy. They really don't. And they blame it on stuff like personal stuff. Maybe, they're suffering from an illness, or they're suffering from a psychological damage, or they're suffering from a trauma. And you say, that's completely understandable. That's completely understandable that you would be the one who cannot have joy. And it's always those people who say to me, but Michael, I do have joy. And I'm thinking, but you're ill. You're suffering something heroic, terrible, rough, whatever you want to call it. They're all condescending ways to look at illness from the point of view of somebody who's healthy, but the bottom line is, when I'm with somebody who is carrying an illness or a disease, and I'm thinking, they should be the one who has no joy. Turns out they're the one with joy. In the darkness, they seem to have a light. And people with trauma, people with all sorts of psychological damage and warfare that they have survived, can very often be the ones who radiate a sense of joy. And it's always that sense of the dynamic, between suffering and joy. It's like there has to be some meaning there in the fact that the pattern shows us people who suffer sometimes are people who are full of joy. And I meet people who really, in one sense, you'd say, my mother would say, they have nothing to worry about. They've good health, they haven't been through any great trauma. They might be worried about, the ecology or the environment or, big political issues or something. But basically they don't have anything great to worry about. Maybe they have, they're doing well financially and all the rest of it. They're the ones sometimes I meet and they have no joy. They look at you and it's all anxiety. It's all about kind of like a negative narrative, a dystopian narrative about the world and about where we're all going. And sometimes I want to pinch them and wake them up and say, would you not realize how amazingly beautiful this world is? No matter what happens, no matter what terrible things are happening, the world in your lifetime is an experience of joy. And if you're not experiencing joy in this short life, you're missing something. And of course, that's where I just keep coming back to religion, because religion is just a whole fabric of techniques that induce joy in your heart. And it's true for Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Hindu, Muslim, Islam, whatever. To be a person of religion, to be faithful, is to be transformed. You can't live within the closed universe of science if you believe. Belief is like completely contradictory. That's why when we get to life in modern Western culture, we get to a place where everybody is enslaved, if you like, by rationalism and by logic and by science. And yes, you can be enslaved by something which is good, or addicted to it. So we become enslaved to modernity. And of course we crush religion because religion is incompatible. It's like a sign of contradiction. I think that was the phrase that John Paul II used. But it still is a strange dynamic. I consciously know when I write poetry or when I read poetry, I know what a metaphor is. I know when I describe something in the language of a metaphor, it's not literally true, but it does have a deeper truth, a truth that can't be grasped in ordinary linguistic phrases, can't be grasped by the rational mind. That's religion. It gives us hope and it gives us faith. It also gives us love because it's simply a practice of remembering that you will be happier the longer and the more that you reach out to help the other person rather than yourself. To make your partner happy is the secret fast track to your happiness. Doesn't matter. It could be your partner, your parent, your child, your pet, an animal outside. It could be, clusters of people that you work with through charity organizations. But to make somebody else happy is a fast track to happiness. What more could you say? You know? Anyway, that's how I feel this morning, reading that. And I'm just really grateful because, again, I've shared this with you because I want to share it with you, but I feel I'm getting so much out of this because I've done a whole process of remembrance there on my mother, and on Sunday I'll be going, or on Saturday anyway, I'll be going to her grave and saying a prayer. So I'll end with just one other little reading from the end of the book that completes the meditation, if you like, on mother, on death, on somebody who passes in your life. And it is to say that there's a way of remembrance which looks at the detail of their life and you bring them to mind. But in the end, the resolution of all the reflections I make on somebody who's passed away is the feeling, the belief that they are in heaven. This is a metaphor, it's metaphorical language, but I believe that it contains a profound truth. They are with God in heaven forever. It was the beloved who transformed Mother's house. She began in February, and I was amazed. In the end it seemed so simple and such fun. She arrived with a Brazilian boy who appeared out of the blue and helped her with the painting. I went to Cavan one day to see the work, and when I saw him, so young and brown as a chestnut without a shirt or vest on him, his skin leaping with light against the backdrop of the white walls, I was speechless. The walls were as cold as a tomb, and he stood there like some perfect angel. The bed was gone from the dining room. There were ladders and wooden boards and paint tins everywhere. They'd been working for about a week by then. First, they had stripped back the wallpaper and painted all the rooms white. Then they pulled out all the carpets and filled 4 skips with old furniture. Beneath the carpet in the kitchen and in the hall, they discovered the original red and cream tiles that had been laid down when the house was built. She had knelt down on them with a knife and scraped them clean with the meticulous attention of a Tibetan lama, and it was her who got the builder to take the doors off and put new French pine doors on. One day she saw a blue nightdress under the bed. "What's this?" she wondered. "Oh, that's just one of her old things." "I meant to get rid of it," I said, and I threw it into a black plastic bag destined for the skip. So much went into that skip. The broken chairs, the old sheets, the useless bed, the faded curtains, the Delft angels, the Child of Prague, the wardrobes, dressing tables, and the music cabinet for holding old records. The skip swallowed her life, her privacy, her illness, and her death. It even swallowed the vinyl records of Beethoven's piano sonatas and the crackling voice of John McCormack, which I used to hear rising through the floorboards of my childhood bedroom as I lay awake at night worrying about school homework. One day, the Brazilian boy found a box of hats, 7 in all, including a feathery green cap, a white straw hat, a beret, and an extravagantly wide-brimmed blue hat like something a young woman might wear at the races. But the box was in tatters, and the Brazilian boy wanted to throw it out. When he asked me, I said I wanted to keep the hats. There was also an empty suitcase beside the hat box, which had my father's initials on it. So the Brazilian boy decided to throw out the tattered hat box and put my mother's headgear into my father's suitcase, which seemed for an instant to bring them both together once again as he handed me the suitcase. I took it home, and it is now in the attic of our cottage in Leitrim, and I suppose in the distant future someone will be surprised by the comedy of a man's suitcase full of ladies' hats, as they forage through all the tracks and traces of private anxiety and trivial obsessions that I in my time may leave in my wake. By July 2013, the work was done. The rooms were painted with a second and final coat. Over the white base they painted soft mushroom and burgundy red, and the chimneys were cleaned and the fires were lit. We thanked the beautiful boy from Brazil for all his help, paid him handsomely before he vanished into the air, and then we sat down in the front room on 2 new sofas, one for her and one for me. We drank a bottle of wine that had been bought in the supermarket in town before going upstairs. Our matrimonial bed, which we had cherished for 20 years since we first bought it in bowls of boil, was now there in the back room, all covered with fresh linen and soft pillows. It was our first night to sleep over, and then in the middle of the night I woke because she was awake. "What are you thinking of?" I wondered, but she didn't say. The following morning was Grave Sunday, a day when the town gathers in the local cemetery to remember the dead who are buried there and to bless all the graves. We drove out for 3 p.m. The crowd had gathered and the priest was already walking around the graveyard in the blazing heat, casting holy water on the graves and on the heads of the faithful. The graves were so tightly laid together that it was almost impossible to find a standing place near my mother's plot. So I stood close to the church as my beloved pushed forward with a wreath for the tombstone. An old man was standing near a tree. He saw me coming and pulled my elbow. Only then did I recognize him as Mr. Dolan, the man with straw hair who had spoken to me at her funeral. He looked even more frail now. I stood with him shoulder to shoulder as he smoked a cigarette. "Where are you now, living?" he inquired. "Leitrim," I replied. He said, "There's no good broadband in Leitrim. You'd be better in Cavan." "How do you know?" I wondered. "About the broadband, Asher, me daughter told me." "I think she's wrong," I said, "but I might do that anyway. Do what? I might come to Cavan and live, now that the mother's house is empty." The voice of the priest through the microphone was uneven in the wind, a humourless roar, like the sound of a machine crushing metal in a breaker's yard far away. The old man said, "There was a Leitrim clergyman one time who came to Cavan as a bishop, and when he got the job, the Leitrim people bought him an Audi, so he could swank around like other prelates. But the new bishop registered the vehicle in Cavan because he didn't want to be seen driving through the lush lawns of his adopted county with Leitrim registration plates. Doesn't that say it all?" I said, "That surely says it all." From the high ground we could survey the congregation, some with hankies on their bald heads, some with elaborate straw hats, and some with their deck chairs right on top of the grass, beneath which their ancestors slept, as they all sheltered from the sun. The priest was perspiring in his heavy vestments. "You're safe enough in Cavan," the old man said. I was wondering if he ever washed his enormous mop of straw hair, or if he ever changed his clothes. I imagined him in the same suit for decades, scything the fields in the heat of June and licking the frost off ice creams in August, with perspiration dripping down his cheeks. Or did he ever wear that suit in bed on winter nights, to keep his bones from freezing. A family of rusty brown cattle with yellow ear tags dozed in a field beyond the graveyard. Mr. Dolan said, "The problem with Cavan is the drumlins. The horizon is always a few feet away. You go round in circles to get to where you started from. Do you know what I mean?" The priest finished his prayers. Mr. Dolan blessed himself. "My mother's grave is over there beside the wall," he said. "She was buried in 1947, a white-haired woman in black shawls, with a chin that would split hailstones, and she could put the turf into the flames with her bare hands. But she was old when I got to know her. She'd spend her days remembering the dead, the lovely young boys who died on the roads and in the Great War, and the old dotes who never woke up for their porridge, and those who were dead in drains or squashed by the plough, or mangled in an unruly mare's grip, or cut in two in the trenches around the Somme." Then he looked over at my mother's grave and he said, "She isn't here either." "I beg your pardon?" "You didn't get the tombstone done yet," he whispered, changing the subject. "You'd need that done. Otherwise people would be wondering. You know what I mean?" "I do," I said. "I'll be looking after it soon." "But she's not here," he repeated, eyeballing me through the cloud from his smoking cigarette. "She's in another place now. They're all gone home." And despite the blue sky at the top of the graveyard, we were engulfed in shadows from the trees behind us. The priest was finished. The people were scattering, and we descended the hill as silent men, trying not to disturb the dead. "Who is that young fella you were talking to?" my wife asked when I got as far as the jeep. "I think his name is Gabriel," I said. "He's a Cavan man, although I only know him as Mr. Dolan." I never saw him again, because he too passed away in the autumn of 2013. And some say he rests now in his own plot beside his mother, where the soil is still heaped up in a mound near the wall beside the trees. But I know he's not there. He's gone with Mother, and Gabriel and Dermot and all the dead, to another place. If I stopped believing in that poetry, I would be dead. May they rest in peace. Thank you for being here. Enjoy the day. Enjoy life. You've been given a gift, a blessed moment, to be here now. Take it. And thank you. Bye-bye.